Can everybody see my painting okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. So this is the photograph that I have been working with. And, you know, obviously one thing that happens in this photograph is there are some light things that are overlapping, things that are much darker behind it. So instead of painting around all of these kind of yellow, brightly colored kind of weed shapes, and the purple flowers, I want to keep those preserved. So those were the parts that I used the masking fluid. And so the masking fluid in the painting, maybe I need to put just a little more light on it. The masking fluid in the painting, it has kept those places kind of protected. So when I went over the darker section of the landscape behind it, I didn't have to worry about it at all, right? Because I had used the masking fluid already. Used lots of green, some brown, some yellow ochre. I think there is sap green mixed with some ultramarine blue in places. So there's a lot of kind of color variation to what I've used in there, but some of it's pretty dark, right? So all of that light stuff, I'm going to be able to pull back, but I'm also going to be able to add things like darker stem shapes and stuff like that on top of that I can still do, right? So I can paint everything darker that's on top of this without any problem. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take my masking fluid off, if it will cooperate and come off. So everything that is covered with my masking fluid, including some of this stuff that is overlapping my water. And this is masking fluid as well. I'm not going to bother with that today because I just want to kind of concentrate, at least for this demo, on this stuff up here in the foreground. So masking fluid is super handy for this. If you are not able to invest in a bottle of masking fluid, this, of course, is possible to do just by painting around the shapes that you want to keep white, right? So it's not impossible, it's just a little more challenging. So some places I've actually forgotten where the masking fluid is. So I'm just kind of running my eraser all over this whole area. And then when it starts to kind of peel off, that might be it there. And then down here in the front, in my photograph, I had there are some rocks that are also pretty white in spots, right? The tops of them, but also places where there's like, you know, whatever that is, lichen or something growing on the rocks that's really light in color. All right, still got some down here. So got quite a bit of white of the paper back, right? So now that I've taken that masking fluid off. So one of the things I'm going to start to think about now that I've got these kind of base colors underneath it is I'm going to mix up the bright colors of these flowers, the weeds. And it looks to me like some of these, in terms of the light sections of them, are almost kind of a yellow ochre, but maybe it's a little bit brighter, right? So what I'm going to do is to take a little bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of cadmium red. So it's actually a burnt sienna, it's not the right one. Put a little bit of my cadmium red, which is this particular version is kind of an orangey red, and then some yellow ochre. And for all of this stuff so far, I've really kind of used a pretty big brush, right? The water, I use this really big, like a 1-inch brush, right? So I did that for the water, the sky, and I did that all at once. And then even for this section up here, I use this brush as well, right? Because a lot of it is wet into wet. Switched a little bit to this one, right? So something in between, but now I'm gonna use something that's a little bit smaller. So a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of cadmium, and what I'm going to start to look at are places in my kind of little weed shapes where I want to have some of that color coming through really nice and bright. And where it gets darker, I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to paint the whole thing because obviously if it's darker, I can go right on top of it. Do a couple more here. And I'm also going to run my brush along the edge of a couple of them just to kind of pull out some of the, just a little bit of the color along the edges, right? So if I feel like it starts to look a little bit too heavy, you can pull some of that out. And then something else I may do is while they are still wet, just do maybe one more. While they're still wet, I'm going to go ahead and put in some of this kind of darker brown, right? This is my burnt umber. I'm going to add some burnt umber to my yellow ochre. And because what I'm noticing here in this one is that it starts to get dark right in the center of it. So I'm going to drop that in right in the center of that little shape and let that bleed out toward the edges. This one is a little darker along the bottom right edge of it. And because these are kind of fuzzy shapes, I'm gonna make those kind of uneven. And maybe this one feels like it gets a little darker along the bottom edge too. Some of these are more rounded than others. So this is kind of the idea of kind of keeping the brightness of that color at first and filling it in with something kind of yellowy orangey. But then I dropped in those darker colors as well to give it a little more of that, a little more of that definition, right, that I'm seeing in the original photo. And then one thing I will switch to while I'm doing my demo here is these bright kind of purpley colored wildflowers. So I've got a little bit of crimson red. And when you guys want to mix a clear or bright purple, definitely use crimson red instead of cadmium red or brilliant red, because crimson red is a little more, it's a little more purple already. It leans a little bit more towards purple, and that's going to give you a clearer, brighter purple. So I've got my ultramarine blue, and same thing with the ultramarine blue. It's more of a purpley blue than something like a phthalo blue, which leans a little more in the green direction. So ultramarine blue and crimson red. And I'm gonna do that for these, just a couple of these purpley flower shapes. And I'm going to paint these flower shapes in before I paint the stems. Because one thing I want to have happen with them is I don't want them to look like they're growing too stiffly, or, I don't want to have a sense of too much stiffness in the painting. So I'm just going to roughly do those stems after I paint after I paint the blossoms themselves. And what I'm also doing here, I know these are kind of small, so it's hard to see, but what I'm also doing is after I lay in that purple, I just kind of pulled a little bit of that color out of the top edge of that flower so that I give a sense of just a little more light hitting the top sides of them. And then I'm allowing a little more of the paint to kind of pool or puddle on the bottom edges, right? So there's a little bit of a distinction there between the top and the bottom of those wildflowers. So there's kind of these purple puffy things, but I obviously let those dry. But after I would fill in all of the kind of yellow weed shapes, all of the purple wildflowers, after those are dry, then I would take that same kind of thin brush. I'm going to use a little bit of my Viridian green. I've got another palette up here, which you probably can't see too well. Let's see if I can pull this up. And I'm mixing my Viridian green, a little bit of my burnt umber, which is my dark brown. And I've got kind of a brownish green, but I want to make it even darker and cooler. So I'm adding a little bit of blue. And you guys know already that the combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber is a really good one to make a nice dark black. So obviously it's kind of the dark version of my green that I'm mixing up. And then I want to look for places where those kind of flower stems are moving down away from the flower shapes. And I know, again, these are super thin, but if I come down here to the bottom of the painting, this is a really dark section of the painting. And if I kind of move my brush up and down over, you know, even though I've got some dark places down here in the painting, if I move my brush up and down over that dark section, just to kind of suggest, you know, the more variety in terms of the direction of these stems, the better. You don't want it to look like fence posts, but you're kind of moving your brush, you know, nature is way more random and weird looking than we assume. So try to kind of keep those in almost a haphazard kind of a way, right? So you're kind of moving your brush left and right. And there is such a thing as overdoing it, right? It is possible to kind of put too many, but this is the thing where you want to kind of keep the point of your brush kind of slipping across the surface of the painting without lingering too long. You don't want it to be like, oh, I can't mess up. Just nice and loose, right? Keep that speed, keep the speed going. So the next stage that I would do would be this section down here at the bottom, right? So after I've finished all of these wildflowers and stuff up here in the front, what I would do next is this section in the foreground. And that's got a lot of kind of darker shapes to it, but I don't want it to look completely smoothly painted. So one good thing about making a painting like this is because we have the imitation of all of those different textures. And we can use what's called a dry brush technique. So if I take my brush and I'm picking up a little bit of my paint, but you notice that it's kind of dry, right? There's not a lot of water in that, right? It's pretty dry paint. So I want to pick up a little bit of that, but my brush is not dripping. There's just paint on it, but kind of just barely. And what I'm going to do for some of these textures down here is something called dry brushing. So what I'm going to do is kind of skip the brush across the surface of the paper
Just a quick question, Professor.
Yeah,
For your dry brushing, is it like, are you just picking up pigment, like very little pigment, or are you adding water to it as well?
I'm adding just a little bit of the washes that I mixed up earlier, but there's not much water in it at all, just enough to kind of let me pull it off the palette with my brush, right?
Oh, okay.
So you see how dry it is?
Yeah.
If it were completely dry, obviously I wouldn't be able to get it onto the brush,
Mhm.
but there's just enough water in there that I'm able to kind of brush what's on the brush and get that onto the paper. But mostly what's happening is the texture of the paper is kind of picking up the paint a little bit, but because the brush is so dry and it's just got that paint on it, you know, can everybody see that? I don't know if the camera is focusing very well. Okay, so there's a really rough kind of texture that you can get with that dry brush technique, right? So you're not filling in a section, you're just kind of almost scraping your almost a dry brush, scraping your almost dry brush onto the surface of the paper. And it's just kind of picking up the top, you know, layer of that kind of rough texture that watercolor paper has, right? That could be a really good way to do things like, you know, these rocks, right? So a lot of that stuff, if I kept going with that kind of dry brush, I would start to kind of build up these little darker pockets. But it, you know, it starts to kind of create the sense that, oh, that's a different kind of texture than something like, you know, the smooth surface of water, for example. So dry brushing is something that can be pretty useful. And it was kind of hard to see what I'm really doing there. And I'm gonna try to look for a clearer demo video of dry brushing so that you can see that up close. So as I worked on that, did you guys have any questions that came to mind? You know, the place in the background in the distance that's in the photograph, right? We have a couple of little islands back here, little strips of land. So those are going to be pretty easy to do because I've reserved that little bit of light, but I can lay in those, you know, almost at the last minute because they're fairly dark, right? So anything that's dark, it's going to be easy to do later on in the process, right? So hopefully that helps just a little bit in terms of, you know, what you guys are going to be doing in terms of your landscape. The landscape